What is idealism and reaction in the errors of extrema?
There's nothing out there. There's no actual causation. Everything that happens in the universe is purely a result of my choice. I only see what I put out there. So you notice that the expressive arrow is open and the perceptive arrow is open. But because the objective, there's no process out there, that means that what goes out and what comes in must be the same. And so in this sense, we have a notion, as you were saying, it's consistent with the notion of idealism. Now, here's the thing. In this particular case, we can say, well, geez, in the same sort of way that it doesn't make sense to close out one of the two processes of perception and expression, what gives us the right or the even reasonable basis to close out either of the things that happen on either side of the plane of perception, right? If I put the plane of perception in a different place, like instead of drawing it horizontally, what if I were to draw it vertically, right? Is there anything special about the position of the plane of perception? Nothing. No, the notion of symmetry is going to apply either way, right? Flow is going to be flow. As far as the perception is concerned, right? Say I basically am looking at the channel like this. Say there's a telephone. We're calling each other on a telephone. We have one of those old-fashioned headsets, right? And there's a wire that connects one thing to the other. Now, rather than being the people talking on the telephone, be the wire, right? You hear one person say something on one side, and you say the exact thing to the other person on the other side, right? You're like a messenger that's passing back and forth. In fact, messengers used to be people, right? So, say for example, you have a messenger that is carrying something from the objective to the subjective. Well, that messenger has its own being, has its own subjective, and from his point of view, if the messenger is a he, the circle that is crossed off in the objective in the idealism case would effectively be his perception, right? So in other words, we've just now created a notion of idealism for the uh, perceptual subjective is now essentially equivalent to prejudice. You follow that? But on the other hand, rather than going into too much detail here, what we're really wanting to look at though is that crossing off any of these processes that essentially interrupts the totality of flow is essentially to have a notion of the real, which cannot be other than incomplete. It's taken the notion of real as a process and it's turned it into a thing, right? Reaction is a thing in the sense of a machine having no consciousness at all, and idealism as a kind of absence of machinery completely and just choice and no reality, ungrounded, right? So in this sense, we're basically saying, well, if you're going to take the notion of reaction as essentially being the complete absence of subjective, it's actually just as bad as idealism, which is taken that the totality of everything is a subjective. And so, in effect, in the same way that we said that, um, realism and prejudice are the same in the sense of aligning to one another, we're saying that reaction and idealism are the same in the sense of being opposites of one another. And then, in the same way that I need to reject one of those opposites, I have to reject the other opposite. Right? That there's a fundamental kind of symmetry that is essentially saying that not only is it not okay to talk about reaction as being in any way realistic about people, right? If we're going to hold that the notion of the first person is a thing, then I have to let go of the notion of reaction. But I can't take the notion of first person to be equivalent to idealism because of this correspondence that's showing up on this slide. So now all of a sudden, the notion of the first person can't be either idealism nor realism. It can't be reaction, and it can't be prejudice. Because if like remember this slide as being after the slide above it. So let's say I looked up the page and right above it I had the other slide, which basically would put reaction on the bottom and prejudice over it. Right. Again, if I rotate the plane of perception, then in effect, what ends up happening is that I can basically say, well, there's a correspondence between the notion of idealism and the notion of prejudice, and there's a correspondence between the notion of reaction and the notion of realism. And oh, by the way, neither of these really work because of the reasons that we stated already. So in effect, somehow or another, we can't assume any of the errors of extrema. All of the errors of extrema must be rejected. None of the circles can ever be crossed off. And so, in this particular sense, you remember back in the beginning, a few weeks ago, when we first started doing this particular segment of our engagement with one another, I basically said, Western philosophy is based upon the notion of dualism, and then that got supplanted by the notion of physical monism. Physical monism is the notion of realism. It's the same concept, but we've just rejected the notion of realism. But you know what? There's no relief in the sense of going to idealism, which would be the usual thing that people would do. They'd say, well, if you rejected realism, then the only other alternative you have is idealism. And in this particular case, what I've just shown is no, idealism doesn't work any better. It's just as bad as reaction and prejudice. And so in this particular sense, we've basically come full circle. We've started from a different premise, foundational triplication of type isomorphism, and we said, okay, we're just going to explore what kind of things these help us to know. And so we did the axioms in a kind of rudimentary sort of way, and then we closed the axioms with this triple of domains, relations, and identities. So then we said, okay, we've got a complete system, and now we're starting to say, well, what does this system say about classic questions that have been around in Western philosophy for, I don't know, a few hundred years at least, probably a few thousand. Depends on whether or not you want to go all the way back to Descartes or the Greeks. And so in this particular sense, we're saying, okay, given that we now have this sort of new form of how to think about the grounds of philosophy, or the grounds of metaphysics, or the very notion of what it means to exist or to be objective, right? Because by the way, we can now distinguish between those three terms, and that by themselves is also a kind of fundamental triplication, right? There are three distinct claims, and in this particular case, we're saying something about the nature of the real. So in the notion of the real, none of the extrema are valid. None of them. And this basically means that, not only did we start from a different place than Western philosophy, but we're now setting ourselves in counterpoise against it. Yeah, that's exactly right. Margaret, I love you. So, in effect, what's happening here is that we have just really closed the door on existing ways of thinking of things. We've, in a sense, discovered an alternative path, and we've made a right angle turn in a place they said that no such path existed. We went straight out of the page. So, welcome to our brave new world of metaphysics.